Hello, everyone. Good evening. And actually, for where I'm coming from this time, it's actually a good afternoon. I'm normally coming from Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, but today I'm actually tuning in from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So for those that have been tuning in from the West, good afternoon as well as the same to myself. I'm the outreach manager of the Laurier Centre for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies in Waterloo, Ontario. And I and the rest of the folks at the Laurier Military Center, as well as our partners, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, the Juno Beach Center Association, and the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, would like to welcome you all to the 6th installment of the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. I can't believe we're already on the back half of this webinar series. It's been a ton of fun. Maybe before I kind of get into things, I want to give you a sense of the reach that we've been able to achieve throughout this webinar series and just a few statistics. So over the course of just 5 webinars, we've actually been able to bring in over 1,000 people, which is tremendous. On average, we're bringing in about 300 to 400 people each webinar. Like I said, 1,000 folks and 1,000 unique people have been tuning in across this entire webinar series. And we've actually have every province and territory represented in Canada, except for the Northwest Territories. So if you know anybody from the Northwest Territories that loves Canadian military history or the Second World War, please tell them to come. I want to be able to say that we've represented each and every province and territory in Canada. And the second geographical reach is beyond Canada too. We've actually been able to reach 20 different states in the United States. So it's a North America wide webinar series, and we've even had people tune in from Europe as well. So just a quick thank you to everyone who's been able to tune in throughout this webinar series. It's been a ton of fun. But before I get into tonight's proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Military Center resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. In 1701, this land fell under the dish with one spoon treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a treaty that was part of the Great Peace of Montreal in the same year that marked the end of the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. It represented and continues to represent today an eternal agreement to not only share and protect resources, but also solve conflicts peacefully. 80-some years later, in 1784, the Haldimand Proclamation was signed between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown, following the American Revolution. And the Haudenosaunee were given a tract of land that extended 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its source just north of Orangeville today to Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and acknowledging their presence in the past and present reminds everyone of the responsibilities we all hold as treaty people. Now, many of you will have heard this script before, and I apologize in advance, but for those who haven't maybe tuned in before and this is your first time, you might be wondering, what is the Maple Leaf Route webinar series and what we're going to be doing tonight and the weeks ahead? Well, since May and all the way until September, I guess we're only about 6 weeks out till we hit that September date, we've been following the Canadians through the battles of Normandy in 1944, from the D-Day beaches through the capture of Caen in July and the fighting towards Falaise in August. And the cost of that fighting, I should say, was enormous. From the 6th of June to the 23rd of August, over 5,000 Canadian service people lost their lives. And any visitor to the war cemeteries in Normandy cannot help but be moved by such losses. Our 9-part series, the 6th of which taking place tonight, features a range of historians asking a range of historical questions. Some of these questions will be tactical, others will consider the little-known role of Canadian women on the battlefield, as we did a month and a bit ago with Sarah Glassford, and others yet will explore the importance of morale like we did 2 weeks ago, and the puzzle of psychological stress, which we'll be doing in about 2 weeks. All our speakers, however, will reflect in some way on the ever-changing ways we remember the Canadians in the battles of Normandy. Now, if after tonight's event and even throughout the series, you feel you have learned something of value, please consider donating to the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association. During these difficult pandemic times, your donations will keep future tours alive and ensure that the Canadian contributions to the Second World War will not be forgotten. This month, the Juno Beach Center Association is promoting the Remembrance Day race. For only $50, you will receive a racing kit that includes a medal, a Lancaster bomber pin, Remembrance Day flag, a poppy seeds, and even a racing bib. Participants can choose from one of 3 historically significant distance options: the Strong Point at 1,500 meters, Juno Beach at 8 kilometers, and Remembrance at 21.1 kilometers, and fundraise for the Juno Beach Center while they walk or run in order for a chance to win a variety of prizes. Join the Juno Beach Center's journey of remembrance and gratitude as they honor the men and women who served during the Second World War. You can donate to both the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association by going to our website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, and click donate at the top of the page. I'll say that one more time, and I'll also share it with you at the bottom of your screen in the chat function, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, and click donate at the top of the page. Now, before I turn it over to my co-host for tonight, I would like to let everybody know, some of you already know this, but you might be finding that closed captioning at the bottom of your screen maybe a little bit distracting. And if you are finding it distracting, just go down to the bottom of your window and click on the CC button at the bottom, and you'll be able to toggle the closed captioning on and off. And of course, if you have questions that come to you at any point during the presentation tonight, please share them in the Q&A function, again, right at the bottom of the window. We'd love to hear from you. And when you ask that question, please let us know where you're coming from. We love to kind of get a sense of the geographical spread of our audience tonight. I've said too much already, taken more than enough time, so I'll turn it over now to Dr. Jeff Hayes to provide a brief overview of our partner for this webinar series, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation. Jeff, your mic is off.
How many times do people tell me that my mic is off? I need that reminder all the time. Well, welcome everyone. As Eric said, I will be brief. We've got a really good presentation coming up tonight, as we do every night. The CBF, La Fondation Canadienne des Champs de Bataille, was formed through a group of Canadian veterans and academics who were concerned that the Canadian role in the battles of Normandy might be forgotten. And the CBF, along with the Juno Beach Center, have worked to ensure that Canadian role in the campaign remains fresh in the minds of visitors to France, not only Canadians, but also Europeans. And as I've mentioned before, the day of commemoration, the 6th of June, is often for Canadians centered at the Juno Beach Center, which brings together participants from many different countries to reflect and remember. The Foundation's acts of commemoration begin the next day at the Canadian Memorial Garden on the grounds of Le Memorial de Caen, at the Place de l'Ancienne Boucherie in Caen, and finally in the Garden of the Abbé Ardennes, where Canadian soldiers were murdered in June of 1944. Those who attend this series of commemorations will know that the Foundation will often actively participate, particularly through the array of remarkable young men and women who've been chosen to take part in the annual study tour. They have included a variety of people from many different backgrounds: Indigenous people, grandchildren of veterans, serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as, and we're being introduced to some of them, future teachers, academics, and decision makers. And we'll hear from one of these alumni in a minute. This is the second year, as we've noted, that the CBF has been unable to organize a student tour. And as such, the Foundation President, General Marc Lessard, agreed that a virtual tour, drawing on a distinguished panel of academics, would give us all a chance to see something of the ground and to discuss some of the great issues that we're still debating as historians about the significance and the meaning of the Canadian presence in the Normandy campaign back in 1944. So if you will, imagine yourselves on the battlefields of Normandy with some of the best guides to inform and inspire you. It is late July 1944, Caen has fallen, and the Americans have just launched their breakout battles to the west, Operation Cobra. And the fighting along Verrières Ridge continues to the south of Caen, leading to the most costly battles for Canada since the Dieppe raid in 1942. In those battles, French-Canadian units and individuals distinguished themselves, and they're remembered today. Rue Colonel Jacques W. Ostiguet marks the road into Saint-André-sur-Orne, where le Régiment de Maisonneuve attacked on the 22nd of July, 1944. 4 kilometers to the east, a Canadian flag sits above the wheat fields of Normandy, marks a plaque near Trotteville Farm, where le Fusiliers Mont-Royal fought 2 days later on the 24th of July. And there, of course, we often refer to the remarkable leadership of the A Company commander and future chief of the defense staff, Jacques Dextrasse. These units, along with le Regiment de Chaudière, who landed on Juno Beach with 8th Brigade, made a difference that Norman summer. And Carolyn will tell us of their contributions and the special challenges that they face. I'd now like to turn it over to Ryan Dion, a CBF alumnus from 2018, to introduce the speaker for this evening and to ask the question I've asked in previous weeks. Ryan, what has the CBF tour meant to you?
Yeah, so there's really 2 things that I took from my tour with CBF. First is that being able to see where the Canadians fought during the First and Second World War helped to improve my understanding of the circumstances and the battles that they fought. Also, the use of maps to pinpoint the exact positions of the Germans and Canadians allowed me to better understand some of the tactics and strategies used, and also how the environment may have influenced some of the decisions made during these battles. The second thing is that it helped me to improve my understanding about how the wars are currently being remembered and presented in Europe, since we visited a lot of memorials, many of which were on the battlefields themselves. We also visited a lot of museums, each of which having their own unique interpretation and displays of certain artifacts and images. So those are really the 2 things that I often think about when reflecting on my tour with CBF. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Caroline Damour. She is a military historian who focuses on Canadian infantry training from 1939 to 1945 and on the participation of Quebec society in the Second World War. Her most recent contributions are featured in the Journal of Military History and Social History, and she's also a historian at Parks Canada and is also a research associate at the International History Institute at Boston University.
Thank you, Ryan. I will just share my screen. There you go. So good evening, everybody. First, I want to say that it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to Canadians all across the country. A special thank you to the Canadian Battlefield Foundation, the Juno Beach Center Association, the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, and the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies. As we know, we will focus tonight on 3 French-Canadian infantry units in Normandy, les Fusiliers Mont-Royal, le Régiment de Maisonneuve, and le Régiment de la Chaudière. We will examine how issues like casualties, reinforcement, morale, but also identity and language specifically impacted the experience of French-Canadian infantrymen in Normandy. When Jeff asked me to talk about French-Canadian in Normandy, my first thought was that this is a great topic, and I was excited about it. Indeed, in the past couple of years, I've noted several times the absence of a specific analysis related to the French-Canadian experience. Again, I was thrilled, but then I remember that most of my research so far was done either on French-Canadian society at war on one side, or the Canadian infantry training on the other, not the French-Canadian infantryman experience. So after cursing Jeff for a couple of minutes, I then had to put together some material. So just keep in mind tonight that it is very much a work in progress on these French-Canadian infantrymen. When I first started to work on this, I had to ask myself one question. Outside speaking French, what was actually different about these men and these units? They share the same organization, same equipment, and same doctrine with their English Canadian counterparts. Still, we will see tonight that they did have a slightly different experience, although they share a lot with their countrymen. But before doing so, we'll take a step back and discuss briefly the backdrop of their presence in Normandy. First thing to begin with is, what are we referring to when we say French Canada and French Canadian? Well, most people assume that we are talking only about the province of Quebec. And in a way, they're not wrong. In 1941, only 800,000 French Canadians live outside the province of Quebec, while 2.7 million of them reside in it. However, since 1945, the historiography and the population in general have focused mostly on French-Canadian attitude in Quebec. Still, we have to keep in mind that a sizable group of French-speaking Canadians were spread all over the country, and these people were also fighting in French-Canadian infantry units during the Second World War. So now that we know who we are talking about, what is it with French Canada and the Second World War? Well, whether in popular memory or historiography, French Canada's response to conflict has often been reduced to question of its massive rejection of conscription for overseas service and its low voluntary enlistment rates. It is true that Francophones in Quebec reject massively conscription for overseas service. When Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King asked to be released from its 1939 promise to not introduce conscription for overseas service through the 1942 plebiscite, results were pretty clear. 73% of Quebec residents vote no. In all other provinces, the yes vote triumphed by some 80%. But this doesn't mean that French Canadians were against the war effort. They just didn't want to be forced to fight in Europe. Of course, French Canadians who were actually willing to serve in the military were not as numerous as the rest of the Canadian population. C.P. Stacey, the Canadian official military historian, were not as numerous, estimates that over 130,000 Quebecers volunteer in the three services. That's about 20% of the male population aged between 18 and 45 years old. At the same time, volunteers in the rest of the country accounted for about 32% of the male population aged between 18 and 45 years old. Of course, many of the Quebecers volunteers were Anglophones. We have to remind ourselves this situation. Quebec was not only made of French Canadian, but it should not be forgotten that many French-speaking Canadians also enlisted in other provinces. So in general, it is true that there were lower enlistment rates in Quebec during the Second World War. Part of the explanation is that French Canadians were not as enthusiastic for the struggle of France and Great Britain as their English-speaking counterparts. The bitter fight over conscription during the Great War did not improve French Canadian attitude towards military service. We also have to keep in mind that several obstacles also reduced the number of Francophones willing to serve. The Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Canadian Navy were working in English only. As for the Canadian Army, outside the infantry, the other arms were not really welcoming for unilingual Francophones. There were several other factors explaining French-Canadian enlistment rates. For example, Jean Parizeau and Serge Bernier used the 1941 census to calculate the excess of male by province, meaning the difference between persons of the two sexes. They note that the reserve of males were in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, in British Columbia, and Ontario, we can see here. So Quebec had a mere 1.9% surplus. Despite all of these obstacles, official statistics show that at least 94,000 Quebecers volunteer for the Canadian Army. What is not always well understood is that they serve in various units overseas, as we can see here. Indeed, out of 17 units serving in Europe, 13 of them were not infantry. 4 French Canadian infantry battalions were actually mobilized in Quebec from the very beginning of the war. Of course, the famous Royal 22e Regiment, or 22, the only French-speaking permanent force unit, which sailed to Britain along with the rest of the 1st Canadian Division in December 1939. From July 1943 onwards, the regiment fought in the Sicilian and Italian campaigns until its transfer to the Northwest Europe front in March 1945. In Normandy, the 21st Army Group included 3 French Canadian infantry units: the Regiment de la Chaudière, a militia unit from Beauce, a region near Quebec City. This unit was part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Along with the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment and the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, the Show, as they were widely known, formed the 8th Brigade, which would storm the Nanwag Beach on D-Day. The French Canadian Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Mathieu, a militia officer who had attracted the attention of the authorities long before the war, according to its regimental history. The Fusiliers Mont-Royal, or FMR, was a militia unit from Montreal, which took part in the infamous Dieppe Raid of August 1942, along with the rest of the 6th Brigade, which included the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders and the South Saskatchewan Regiment. Following this disastrous assault, the regiment will be reorganized almost from scratch and retrained until 1944, when it will go to Normandy. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Govreau, had a leading personality, while his officers and NCOs were considered exceptionally fit and keen. One company commander, as Jeff mentioned, Jimmy Dextras, had already attracted attention as an experienced leader. Another militia unit from Montreal, the Régiment de Maisonneuve, was first in the province to reach full wartime strength and among the first in Canada. The battalion will be part of the 5th Brigade with the Calgary Highlanders and the Black Watch. However, in the last month of 1943, the performance of the Maisonneuve will be noted as below average, like the Calgary Highlanders actually. If the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bisaillon, was considered a competent soldier, but no more, his second in command, Major Julien Bibeau, was deemed excellent. In Normandy, the unit will fight as part of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Unfortunately, on the eve of the invasion in April 1944, these 3 battalions were not full strength. 60 other ranks were needed to complete their war establishment. In addition, there were only 348 French-speaking infantry soldiers within the reinforcement stream in Great Britain. For 3 infantry regiments about to be engaged in high-intensity combat, this was quite clearly insufficient, as the estimated requirements to provide 90 days reinforcement for them amount to a little more than 1,500 other ranks. So around that time, Canadian military authorities in Ottawa adopted a policy favoring dispatching already formed and trained units of conscript soldiers overseas. Thus, the 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade was mobilized for active service in 1944, a few weeks after returning from Kiska. The promise of sending units overseas as active force contingent that would be kept intact, provided they were up to strength, was meant to encourage men from the 4 infantry battalions in the brigade to volunteer. In the end, Le Régiment de Hull arrived in England on June 1944 with 436 men. Le Régiment de Montmagny was also sent based on the same provision after having absorbed volunteers from Le Régiment de Joliette to reach the 500 men minimum needed to sail. Thus, from May 26 to July 28, 1944, the estimated number of French-speaking infantry reinforcements sent from Canada was 1,630 other ranks. However, several of them will not be available immediately for fighting units. To increase the strength of the 3 infantry battalions and to provide the necessary reinforcement, General H.D.G. Crerar, 1st Canadian Army commanding officer, ordered the transfer of the 228 French-speaking infantrymen then serving with English-speaking unit of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the 4th Canadian Armored Division on May 22. To provide for the requirement, remaining on field, a sufficient number of French-Canadian personnel will then be remustered from other arms and services. This remustering was confined to general duty personnel and was not to exceed 5% of the unit strength. A total of 424 soldiers were deemed eligible to be remustered as general duty reinforcement for the French-Canadian battalions. Concern over the shortage of French-speaking infantrymen were not resolved by these measures. Counting personnel remustered during this period, mainly from artillery and arrivals from Canada, the 3 French-Canadian battalions could draw only on 1,200 infantry reinforcements, or enough to cover 60-day wastage at intense rate. Staff at Canadian military headquarters in London were still worrying about finding enough reinforcements for these units for the rest of the summer of 1944. So during the Battle of Normandy, these battalions experienced high level of battle casualties. Together, these 3 French-Canadian units will fight during the 3 bloodiest months of the Northwest Europe campaign, as the Normandy campaign will see the same scale of casualties as those of the First World War. In Normandy, the infantry accounted for 70% of all casualties combined, though it made up less than 5% of the total Canadian force. So what about the action for our French-Canadian unit? Well, the Chaudière went into action at Bernières-sur-Mer, already short of 17 other ranks, as the regiment was not completed. The battalion lost a few men equal to the normal strength of a rifle company on June 6, 1944, and more than the equivalent of another company in a platoon between 4 July and July the 12th, during the Battle of Carpiquet. On July 18, the unit took part in the Battle of Caen, where it advanced on Colombelle and then the Faubourg de Vaucelles, fighting in which it encountered another 100 casualties. After these battles, the regiment had to be used with care, and thus mainly in a supporting role during Operation Tollies and Tractable. Still, after almost 3 months of fighting in Normandy, the regiment suffered a total of 651 battle casualties. We have to keep in mind that these numbers do not include battle exhaustion, absence without leave, desertion, and self-inflicted wound. The FMR went into action in the Battle of Bourguebus Ridge, already short of 12 other ranks. As part of the second phase of Operation Atlantic, the FMRs were to take Beauvoir and Trottval farms and then Verrières. On July 20th, the unit captured both Beauvoir and Trottval farms, but sides B and C companies almost completely destroyed the day after. On July 24, the FMR was able to recapture the Beauvoir and Trottval farms. And a week later, the regiment took part in the attack of the church in Saint-Martin-de-Fontenay in preparation for the push toward Falaise. On August 7, the French-Canadian battalion was able to capture Meusenet as part of Tractable. The regiment was then ordered to take La Commanderie near Claire-Tison on August 14. Unfortunately, the attack did not succeed and the FMR lost around 90 casualties and several prisoners. 3 days later, the battalion was still able to take Falaise. But like all infantry units from Canada, the FMR suffered a heavy toll, a total of 450 battle casualties in about a month of fighting in Normandy. And again, not including other type of casualties. The Macy's, so the Maisonneuve, the Régiment de Maisonneuve, attack on Fleury-sur-Orne on July 19 did not start well with the second, with two lead companies advanced 200 yards past the start line and were trapped in their own walking barrage, which cost them at least 32 men. The battalion lost the equivalent of a company between July 20th and July 26th while attacking Etavo and trying to capture Meusenet. The failed attack on the church in Saint-Martin-de-Fontenay between July 28 and July 30 cost them another platoon. On August 6, as the men lined up near the mobile kitchen to collect their food, two 88mm shells fell directly into the middle of the group, killing and wounding 34 men. As part of Operation Totalize, the regiment were able to capture the hill near Quilly village on August 8. On August 13 and 14, the Maisonneuve tried to secure the high ground above the village of La Chesnay near Clairtizon, but ran into a well-prepared position. Like the FMR, the Macy's suffered a total of 466 battle casualties in over just a month. So as we can see on this chart, these figures highlight the losses sustained by the three French-Canadian regiments from June to August 1944. When compared to other Canadian infantry units, there was nothing exceptional about it. All of them faced stiff opposition and sustained a large number of battle casualties throughout those 3 months. Indeed, the 2nd and the 3rd Canadian Division spent respectively 23 and 21 days in intense combat between June and August 1944, more than any other 21st Army Group formation, except the 3rd British Division. Unfortunately for the French-Canadian battalions, the reinforcement system was not able to keep up with the Normandy campaign's demands. As we can see on this chart, the three French-Canadian infantry units experienced considerable shortages during the month of August. When we compare the French-speaking average and English-speaking unit deficiencies data for the month of August 1944, we can see that French-speaking unit generally suffer much more from other rank deficiencies than the rest of Canadian infantry units. These shortages will affect the combat efficiency of the three French-Canadian units for the whole Normandy campaign. The case of the Regiment de Chaudière can illustrate the impact of these shortages on French-Canadian units. On July 26, it was short of 250 men. When this unit attacked Meusenet on August 5, the situation meant that the actual strength of its 4 companies would vary between 40 and 60 soldiers, when it should include 120 infantrymen. One of its few survivors at the Battle for Clairtizon on August 1914, Germain Desrochers, recalled the impact of the lack of reinforcement on a section that usually include 12 men. Ce soir-là, 14 août, ma section a reçu comme renfort Romuald Morin de Saint-Romuald et le soldat Girard. Notre section s'était renforcée de 100%. Nous étions maintenant 4. Charlie Forbes, a lieutenant with the Régiment de la Chaudière, note in his memoir that les batailles de Clairtizon dans le secteur de Mesnil nous avaient coûté cher en vies humaines. Au bataillon, il ne restait que 450 hommes sur les 900 que nous étions au départ. La compagnie des renforts était vide. À la compagnie D, nous étions à peine 40 hommes sur des effectifs de combat qui auraient dû être de 120 combattants. Depuis Saint-André, je restais le seul lieutenant à avoir survécu dans la compagnie. Nous aurions dû être 3. Alexandre Anger, a company commander in the Régiment de Maisonneuve, recalled years later, en fait, j'étais commandant d'une compagnie qui normalement devait avoir 3 pelotons qui auraient représenté 125 hommes. Alors j'en avais 50, mais la difficulté, c'est qu'on avait des tâches de compagnie de 125, mais qu'on était obligé d'accomplir avec 50. Et puis ça a été comme ça tout le temps que j'étais là, jusqu'à près de Calais à Borbourg. Par la suite, la situation s'est un peu améliorée. The question was the same for the Régiment de Maisonneuve war, and the war diarist note on July 28 that A company under Captain Alexandre Anger command with a strength of approximately 45 men will attack Saint-Martin Church, while C Company has the job to secure the X Road north of Saint-André. A Company is repulsed. Stiff opposition was encountered. Jerry's machine guns caused heavy casualties. A Company withdrawn to reorganize. Unfortunately for them, then the 3 French-Canadian infantry battalions will suffer deficiencies until the end of 1944. Indeed, on November 19, these regiments were still short a total of 282 other ranks, the equivalent of 94 soldiers per unit. As we have seen throughout the summer, throughout this web series, the fighting in Normandy was brutal. From June through the middle of August 1944, Canadian battles were attritional, costly, and most progress could only be measured in meters. In light of this, how French-Canadian infantrymen were able to keep their morale, their willingness to fight and to persevere in fighting. Well, as other Canadian units, morale seemed high before going into action. When the Chaudière was briefed on May 22nd by Brigadier Blackadder, the commanding officer of the 8th Brigade, the war diary entry for the day mentioned that everyone is very satisfied and very confident in the success of our weapons. 4 days later, the war diarist was in the same mood. All are very confident of success and all are very enthusiastic. We can find the same enthusiasm in the Fusiliers Mont-Royal war diary. 3 entries qualify morale as excellent, very high or very good, between July 12 and July 17. Even after the unit's first battle, the diarist still made a reference to a very good morale on July 23. However, we can see the impact of the bitter fighting, as it was the last entry on this topic for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. No more glorious detail in the war diaries from the Fusiliers Mont-Royal or the Maisonneuve or La Chaudière. With the bitter fighting encountered by the 3 French-Canadian units, it is expected that the willingness to fight will vary. The state of French-Canadian morale can be assessed in part through non-battle casualties, meaning absence without leave, desertion, self-inflicted wounds, and battle exhaustion. If we take the period from June 6 to July 12, when the Régiment de Maisonneuve and the Fusiliers Mont-Royal were not even in combat, these 3 battalions had 157 non-battle casualties and over 100 only for the Regiment de la Chaudière. The Régiment de Maisonneuve seemed even more in bad shape after its entry in battle. Indeed, this unit had the highest exhaustion rate of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Between July 19 and August 6, this unit counted 95 battle exhaustion cases. The Macy's also had a high rate of absence without leave. Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal had a large number of absence without leave, and most deserter, 45, in the 2nd Division. However, they had the lowest number of battle exhaustion in the same division. For the Regiment de la Chaudière, they had a high rates of battle exhaustion, self-inflicted wounds, desertion, and absence without leave. But we have to be careful when we use these statistics. Indeed, when we look at desertion rate, we have to keep in mind that it was far easier for French-speaking personnel to remain lost to the army in Western Europe than for men whose mother tongue was English. Even more, if we take the number of prisoners, it seems quite low actually. In Normandy, the 3 French-Canadian units only had 39 prisoners altogether, 38 for the Chaudière. We can see this as a sign of high morale and a good fighting spirit. Additionally, as Terry Cup and Bill McAndrew warn us in their excellent study battle exhaustion ratio are not a good number to base a unit's overall performance. With a very large number of casualties, French-Canadian unit consists increasingly of reinforcement and thus could not always be considered a current body of men. The Regiment de Chaudière, for example, had lost 651 killed, wounded, and missing in 10 weeks of combat, or a little over 80% of their war establishment, their fighting strength. In this situation, a very high breakdown rate must be expected for a lack of emotional ties among the men and between the men and their non-commissioned officers and officers. But what probably affected even more these three French-Canadian infantry units was the number of remastered reinforcement. A second British Army psychiatrist report noted that many of the battle exhaustion casualties were untrained reinforcement, meaning clerks, cooks, storemen, and the like, which were sent forward as rifleman reinforcement. However, we know that in May 1944, it was decided that over 400 French-Canadian general duty soldiers were remastered for these three units in light of concern over the predicted shortage of French-speaking infantrymen. This means that it was an average of 145 remastered soldiers by unit only for Normandy. Let's take the case of Le Régiment de la Chaudière. If we use personnel record of soldiers who died in service during the Second World War as a sample, we can see that a little more than one reinforcement out of 5 was remastered during the Normandy campaign. Although we don't have right now the equivalent numbers for English-speaking units, we know that a first group of 2,000 artillery, engineer, and armor corps general duty personnel were remastered in March 1944. However, these men were spread between 18 English-speaking infantry battalions. As a result, the proportion of soldiers remastered to infantry in English-speaking units during the Battle of Normandy was lower than that of French-speaking unit. Indeed, an average of 111 remastered soldiers by unit compared to 145 for French-speaking unit. This might explain why battle exhaustion rates were higher in French-speaking battalion than in their English-speaking counterparts. As for the high rates of absence without leave, Lieutenant Colonel E.T. Jacques, a company commander with the Régiment de Maisonneuve in Normandy, explained, Fatigue was a serious problem with our unit due to the lack of rest. We had numerous cases of first-class soldiers going AWOL or absent without leave for a few days. The reason given by them on their return was that the only way they could get any rest was by going AWOL. For Le Régiment de la Chaudière, mental fatigue was also a problem at the end of July. When they finally left at the front on July 21st for 7 days of rest. The show had been engaged in combat for a total of 52 days out of 56. As Jean-Paul Boucher, a soldier in the support company, contextualized. Au fil des jours et du spectacle lancinant des blessés, des morts et des gars qui basculaient dans la folie, je perdais les dernières parcelles d'innocence qui m'habitaient encore à l'aube du 6 juin. L'appréhension, le découragement causé par les conditions de vie difficiles, l'incertitude et l'inquiétude lors des contre-attaques allemandes prenaient parfois le dessus. Malgré la mauvaise nourriture et les rumeurs de guerre, je luttais pour que triomphe mon honneur. Je ne voulais pas abandonner, il ne fallait pas flancher. À d'autres moments, surtout la nuit en plein combat, un peu écarté, j'ai pensé en finir, disparaître du monde en feu. Of course, French-Canadian morale and willingness to fight waver at several points in Normandy, but at no point did low morale appear to seriously compromise fighting effectiveness. Despite heavy casualties and infantrymen shortages, French-Canadian infantry units in Normandy showed their willingness to fight, and their strong esprit de corps was recognized by some of their countrymen. Indeed, the censorship report from 21st Army Group for the second part of July 1944 noted a comment from a soldier of the 3rd Canadian Division signals. The Chaudière of Montreal deal with the snipers. What a wild bunch they are. Don't give a damn for nothing, those guys, and damn good men, every one of them. Still, the question remains how French Canadian infantrymen were able to keep the willingness to fight and to persevere in fighting. First thing that might have helped was the degree to which these units kept their regional identity despite the heavy losses. Studies already show that the Royal 22e Régiment, le Régiment de Maisonneuve, and the Regiment de Chaudière were all able to maintain regional distinctiveness. Querar's decision in May 1944 to not reinforce French Canadian infantry unit with English-speaking personnel, even though they were facing critical shortages, meant that these three regiments retained their French Canadian and Quebecois character throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. Indeed, for le Régiment de Maisonneuve, 4 men out of 5 were either born or lived in Quebec, while proportion of le Régiment de la Chaudière was around 3 out of 4 men. The rest of the group came mostly from Ontario and New Brunswick, where there were large Francophone communities. Although we don't have actual information about the regional identity for les Fusiliers Mont-Royal, there is no reason why it shouldn't be any different. This is in sharp contrast with 2nd and 3rd Division's English-speaking regiment. Robert Engen, in his study Strangers in Arms, showed that at the start of the Normandy campaign, on average, 75% of the soldiers in any given infantry battalion were from the regiment's home military district. However, every regiment regional distinctiveness declined quickly between June and August 1944. By August, the average among all Canadian battalions in Normandy had gone down to only 51%. Although regional identity was not a prerequisite for regimental pride and esprit de corps, the local distinctiveness was still a core part of military identity. This factor could have played a role in French Canadian infantrymen's combat motivation and thus helped these 3 regiments keeping their military effectiveness throughout the Normandy campaign. Roman Catholicism was also an important part of French Canadian identity during the Second World War. Still, historian Yves-Yvon Pelletier showed 20 years ago about le Régiment de Maisonneuve and le Fusiliers Mont-Royal that as the intensity of the fighting continued, soldiers and officers lived every hour knowing that their lives were in constant danger, and they turned to their padre in unprecedented numbers for the sacraments of communion and confession. September 1944 saw the number of communion quadruple and the number of confession doubled compared to April of the same year. What Mr. Pelletier is telling us is that although it is hard to assess if it did reinforce regimental spirit and esprit de corps, one could think that this common characteristic might have helped create a strong shared identity between French Canadian soldiers. And this very characteristic, along with language, might also have helped create a special bond with French civilians and thus strengthen French Canadian infantrymen's willingness to fight. As Terry Cup briefly mentioned in the first part of the Maple Leaf Route webinar series, the Régiment de la Chaudière was warmly welcomed as soon as the battalion set foot on French soil, as the War Diary entry for June 6 noted. Les Français de Bernières sont assez accueillants et beaucoup nous acclament au milieu des ruines de leur maison. And as we can see here, the famous CBC war reporter, Marcel Ouimet, explained that French Canadian soldiers were struck by the warm welcome. On nous a reçus avec des roses dans les rues de ce petit village du nord de la France où nos troupes ont effectué ce matin un débarquement massif. Des roses et des sourires qui éclairaient les figures des nombreux civils qui n'avaient pas quitté leur patelin malgré la violence du bombardement aérien de la nuit dernière et de la préparation d'artillerie qui a précédé l'assaut des plages. C'était le cœur serré qu'on entendait cet accent du nord de la France, celui-là même que nos ancêtres ont apporté avec eux au Canada et qu'ils ont jalousement préservé. The emotion was strong for the French-Canadian war reporter, Wallet, who noted that the astonishment of the French at these soldiers who have come from elsewhere and yet speak their language. Je n'oublierai jamais la façon dont les citoyens français et les soldats du Régiment de Québec, le Régiment de la Chaudière, s'interpellaient ce matin dans les rues du village. « Mais ils ont un accent normand », disaient les villageois, tandis que certains de nos poilus expliquaient qu'ils avaient attendu 4 ans à l'heure de débarquer en France. À l'hôtel Belle-Plage, où certains citoyens avaient trouvé refuge, on servait à boire à nos soldats, des vins qui n'avaient rien de vieux, cru, mais qui tout de même désaltéraient, et du Calvados, of course, l'apéritif local. Jamais, je crois, on a vu autant de gens se réjouir malgré leur malheur. On June 11, 1944, Marcel Ouimet reviewed the events of the first week of the Allied offensive operation. In Normandy, French Canadians did not feel like strangers, he told the CBC French network. Nous ne sommes en France que depuis 5 jours, mais on dirait surtout pour les Canadiens de langue française que nous y sommes depuis toujours. La Normandie, cette Normandie que l'on veut toujours revoir, comme le dit la chanson. Après tout, c'est un peu chez nous. D'autant plus chez nous aujourd'hui que certains de nos soldats y dorment leur dernier sommeil, sous ce sol riche que leurs ancêtres ont quitté pour aller fonder la Nouvelle-France. This feeling seemed to have been shared by soldiers from le Régiment de Maisonneuve. The War Diarist noted on July 14, "Today a guard of honor had been chosen from le Régiment de Maisonneuve to assist the celebration of the Bastille Day at Roche. The ceremony consists of high mass with French Reverend Father Beaulieu officiating. After mass, appropriate speeches for the occasion were made by Father Beaulieu and by Canadian Catholic chaplain Guy Laramé. The parade then broke off and the band played light music and march tunes of 1914 and 18. The senior officers present were then invited to the mayor's, Monsieur Philippe, residence, where bottles of champagne, hidden since the occupation, were opened in honor of the liberation of this part of France. The Canadian officers then presented personal subscription towards the reconstruction of the parish church. These were accepted with great emotion by Father Beaulieu. Lieutenant Colonel Bisaillon and Major Bibot, accompanied by local people, went to the cemetery to offer prayers for one of the Frenchmen who died a victim of the German tyranny. The warm feeling was mutual. Maurice Desjardins, a Canadian press war reporter, reported in July 1944 words of a French veteran from the First World War. Les Canadiens français n'ont pas changé. Je les connais bien, vous savez. Je suis un vieux poilu et j'ai fait Vimy avec les Canadiens. Si je suis ému aujourd'hui, c'est que je pense que parmi ces jeunes hommes, il doit sûrement se trouver des fils de mes frères d'armes de 14. Journalists Alain Stanquet and Jean-Louis Morgan mentioned in their 2014 book on D-Day the feeling of a French woman. Madame Pesselin a un meilleur souvenir des libérateurs, notamment des Canadiens passant de porte en porte dans le village en feu de rane, dans l'Orne, qu'ils étaient en train de délivrer. Comme plusieurs Normands, sa parenté et ses amis furent agréablement surpris de retrouver de lointains cousins sous l'uniforme des Tommies. Par rapport aux Américains dont la langue était incompréhensible et dont les habitudes semblaient bizarres, les Normands se sentaient plus proches des Canadiens francophones. Thus, French civilians and French Canadian soldiers seem to share a widespread feeling of mutual trust, probably due to their common language and religion. This was in stark contrast with the general feeling among Canadian troops. According to the censorship report from 21st Army Group for the second part of June 1944, there was widespread comment on the French civilian population, and the most varied opinion of them were expressed. As a whole, however, the French are regarded with suspicion, and the presence of many snipers, both men and women, was frequently reported, end of quote. A month later, this feeling would be more positive. Indeed, the censorship report for July 16 to 31st, 1944, noted that, open quote, excellent relation seemed to exist between the troop and the French civilian population, and the former distrust had apparently disappeared, end of quote. At the end, French-Canadian infantry units' morale was based on a strong group identity and was probably strengthened by a renewed motivation to fight for people who, in the end, shares so much with these men. This might help explain why French-Canadian soldiers were able to keep the willingness to fight and to persevere in fighting, while at the same time, they were facing heavy casualties and critical reinforcement shortage. They were true Canadian in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was just excellent. You covered so much stuff that, so much good material, and you're on top of the research. So it was really exciting to hear some ideas there that reflect some of your research interests and some of the new source material that's coming out, and especially the discussion about morale. I think it was just really, really good. I think Ryan and I are going to share the question and answers as best we can, but of course we have the right to intervene and ask all the questions that we want, you see, but we'll do our best to address some of the questions that have come up, which are very good. And I will ask Ryan to, and of course, please, of course, answer in either language that you'd prefer, and however way these questions are offered. We'll just begin with one from David Patterson, who is a former president of the CBF, and he just makes mention the only French-Canadian artillery unit to deploy overseas is the 4th Régiment Moyen Artillerie Royale Canadien, often overlooked in the narratives. And its support to the Poles at Mount Hermel at the end of the Normandy campaign is a story that needs to be told. And have the infantry units, which we emphasize today, tended to obscure the stories of those non-infantry units. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, yes, that's why I tried to mention it at the beginning of the presentation, that yes, we had like in Northwest Europe, but in Normandy we had 3 infantry units, but we did have other French-Canadian infantry units, pardon me. So this is, as David Peterson rightly say, this is always kind of an oversight when we don't talk about these other units. I wish I would have been able to do it, but unfortunately, my focus mostly in my research has been infantry units, and with the Library and Archives Canada just being reopening, I was not able to go and dig a bit in these units. But it is very true that we need to go elsewhere in the Canadian Army and see what else we French Canadians contributed to.
Yeah, absolutely. The all of us, including Ryan, we're all saying, well, we'd really like to do that research, but LAC, the Library and Archives, isn't open yet. So
yes,
someone out there is going to urge LAC to open up full time so that we can all get back to the archives and answer those kinds of questions. Howard Hisdow, forgive me, Howard, if I've mispronounced your name. I think we've answered the question very well, the relationship between French civilians and you mentioned about French resistance members in Normandy. Did anything come up in your research about relationships with the resistance?
I know we have some feedback. I've not focused. I tried to show you the testimony that were more relevant for what I wanted to say. But yes, we did. The French Canadian infantrymen, they were able to connect it to the resistance, and of course the feeling was again mutual. It was warm, and I think is it on June 6th with the Regiment de Chaudière, there was someone from the resistance that was actually giving some detail about where the German whereabouts. So of course there were strong link there too. It was a whole part of the society that actually, but of course we don't have the other part of the collaborationists, maybe
Yeah.
they were not so enthusiastic. I didn't find anything about that. But from what I've seen so far, the people from France, they were really welcoming, and pretty surprised that these Tommies but were speaking French, and with this shared language and religion, as I was saying, it was a first step, so much easier than for the English Canadian soldiers.
Yeah. And with the same accent.
Yes,
That
exactly.
always-
Yes.
Yeah.
And not only that, I had a friend from France, and she was from Normandy, and not only accent, but common language and terms that we both use in both parts, in France and in Canada.
Isn't that bizarre? I'll just make one quick question, and then I'll pass it on to Ryan for the next question. You mentioned about intelligence and about relationships with both resistance members and with collaborationists, I suppose. The intelligence arm in the Normandy campaign by 1st Canadian Army is, producing reports of enormous detail.
Yes.
And one wonders too, and I'd never thought of this until your presentation, there must have been a bulk of Francophone bilingual officers or staff who were doing those interviews, doing those interrogations, I suppose,
Yes.
because they're really a rich source
Yes.
of what the ground looks like from the perspective of as you say, from the perspective of resistance and trying to understand who to trust and who to speak to.
Yes.
So that's an element that I suppose we'd, yet another rabbit hole for us to jump down.
Exactly. And this is interesting because I did some research on Franco-Americans. And this is one of the things they were putting forward of all their seriousness about the war and how they want to contribute to the war effort. They were like, hey, we can go to France, we can speak French, and we can help our country. So what was true for the Franco-Americans, I'm pretty sure was also true for the French Canadian.
A new area to explore.
Yes.
Ryan, you lead on with the next question, as whichever one you'd pick.
All right. So we have another question here from David Patterson. He asked, is one of the reasons that the French Canadian infantry units were short of replacements is that there were fewer French Canadians in other arms and services available for remuster?
Well, of course, like other Canadians, French Canadian knew that infantry was a very dangerous arm. So those of them that were able to speak English, they also choose to go elsewhere. And that is very true. And this is something I want to dig more, but I'm pretty sure that at that time, there were actually a lot of bilingual French Canadians. So they were probably quite able to go elsewhere and in less dangerous place than infantry. So yes, that totally will explain partly, I should say, that would partly explain why we had so much problem with reinforcements and shortages and all. But I have to admit that as I was talking earlier in the presentation, of course, there were less people from Quebec and those French Canadian part in New Brunswick and Ontario. There were less people willing to serve. And this was probably one of the problems. The other problem that I didn't mention is that maybe we did a little more than what should have been done with all these 17 units, French Canadian units. Maybe with a bit less, we would have been able to reroute these people in infantry if needed. But yes, totally, we do have problems with people going outside of infantry. But I would not blame them.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I have one here in French. His name is Jean-Marc No. He's from Lévis, Quebec. He asked, pourriez-vous nous dire un mot sur les pertes subies par les régiments francophones pour la suite de bombardements alliés. Son oncle a été une victime sur le 14 août 1944.
C'est difficile à dire. J'ai pas regardé cet aspect-là au complet. Comme leurs camarades anglophones, eux aussi ont eu des problèmes avec certains bombardements amis quelquefois. Ça fait partie des réalités du combat en Normandie. Mais je dois avouer que j'ai pas creusé cet aspect-là spécifique des bombardements. J'ai fait une petite mention, mais très légère. Donc, ça serait quelque chose effectivement à voir, mais je ne suis pas certaine que ça serait très différent de la situation des autres unités canadiennes. Les bombardements touchent tout le monde. Toutes les unités ont des pertes importantes en général. Donc, ça serait quelque chose à creuser, mais je ne suis pas certaine qu'on aurait plus d'informations qui distingueraient les Canadiens français à ce niveau-là.
Let me see here. One short question from Stephen Smith. What percentage of the North Shore New Brunswick regiment was Francophone?
That is actually interesting. I went through the regimental history, and we know that at the beginning of the war, there was quite several French-Canadian infantrymen. But then when I was doing research for this presentation, there was a source at LAC that was actually saying that I think it's 168 out of a little over 800. So almost 1 out of 5 men were from French-Canadian descent. So that's quite interesting. And of course, the military district where they were coming from, it's totally making sense. They were from New Brunswick region that were actually, where Francophone were actually very present.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Let me just scroll here. We have another question from Mark Q. Let me just see. Given the conscription tug of war in the province of Quebec, what censorship did the Canadian forces and the federal government implement regarding French-Canadian battlefield casualties? And did the media cooperate?
I'm not quite sure about censorship. What I've been through several newspapers. I don't know about the official part of the story, but when I've been through Quebec French-Canadian or French-Canadian newspapers, we see a lot. We see a lot of casualties. We see a lot of people, these soldiers from, let's say, Quebec City, died or is wounded, and etc. So we have a lot of information about these casualties, and especially in Normandy, we can see in newspaper that there was a good coverage actually of the battle and the casualties and the problems that they encounter. Of course, they were not saying, "Hey, there are actually shortages of infantrymen in such specific way," but we know a lot about casualties and wounded and people that are not are trying to come back but are not alive anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just I could comment on that quickly. There wouldn't have been, I mean, the casualty figures are being printed across the country. So it would be exceedingly difficult to restrict the casualty figures from one part of the country,
Yes.
you know, to Quebec, say, or to Acadie. So, you know, in that sense, the numbers were as, I think, as transparent, if that's
Yes.
the right word, across the country, both in English and French-speaking Canada.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I could just quickly jump in, Carolyn, just for a question, because I think, Jeff, you've mentioned these a number of times, and we've heard from people referring to censorship reports, and there's a question from Margaret Kipp. Might be helpful for some of our viewers that don't know what these censorship reports are. So I'm wondering if you could describe what they are,
Yes.
what they do, and what's their purpose.
These sources are fantastic. each and every time that I'm going and diving into these, because I've done it for my PhD thesis, and then I came back for this research. These are super interesting. So mostly what the censorship report were actually were a sample, a very big sample of letters that were going through censorship officer, and they were kind of scanning to have an image, a picture of what was going on actually in our troops at that point of time. So it was always a 2 weeks period sample, and they were talking about distinct topics. So training, morale, food, every kind of things that could kind of feed them and see if their troops were actually disgruntled or were not motivated anymore. And this is going through the whole Northwest campaign. We have censorship report for the Italian campaign too. Same with United Kingdom. So for 4 years, as everybody knows, the Canadian Army was in United Kingdom, and there were censorship report, and there again we could see how the morale of the troop was, and this give a very detailed information about how our troops were actually going through, and this is very interesting.
Absolutely wonderful source, aren't they? I mean, it's as if the censorship people found out that, for the most part, troops didn't give away too many security secrets.
Yes.
So then they decided, oh, this is a really good way of assessing morale. So it was
Yes.
as if they found a kind of secondary role to keep these reports going over the time. And and Carolyn's right. I mean, they're just an extraordinary source. We don't see as many though, in part because the censors themselves were largely British.
Yes.
We don't see them translating. At least I haven't. Maybe you have, Carolyn. Translating French text or anything of that kind.
I've not seen much. Actually, my guess is that because what we can see from the French Canadian unit, there's only a few. So my guess is that only those which were written in English were actually picked up, and those in French were probably just kind of passed out.
Yeah, I wonder. I think that's my impression too.
Yeah, I can't tell for sure, but that's my wide guess.
Yeah. Excellent. Let's see here. Oh, we've got more and more questions here. We're going to try to answer everyone, but forgive us if we don't answer all. You want to take the next one, Ryan?
There's a really Sure. There's a really interesting question here by Paul Ulrich. He's asking if the anti-war sentiment in Quebec affected the morale of French Canadian troops in Normandy.
I would say yes and no. In a way, no, because I don't think French Canadians were actually surprised. they knew a lot about it. They knew the sentiment back home. But I've seen references about, I think it's Charlie Forbes from Le Regiment de la Chaudière, and he's saying like, those people that are back home and conscript that don't want to come here and da-da-da. So he's complaining about it. So in a way, they feel and they share the same feeling that they're the English Canadian who are with them overseas. They're like, what else should we do except having conscription? And from the infantry standpoint, I totally get it. They were dying. And people who were not actually dying at this moment, they felt that it will come sooner than later. And they were questioning why they didn't have all the reinforcement needed when they were actually fighting for their country. So I think in these French Canadian unit, the soldiers were in a way feeling a bit not depressed. I would not say depressed because I cannot say for sure, but of course they were affected by it. But at the same time, they knew that the feeling back home was actually, again, well, in Quebec at least mostly, was against conscription. So they kind of knew where it was coming from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's something I always was curious of. But he asked that question.
Yes,
but it's interesting
always.
too, isn't it, that that connection with home is so important.
Yes.
But you're making the case that it's the connection to Normandy, which is probably a stronger factor within the French-speaking units in Normandy.
Well, but my feeling, because from what I've seen, again, looking through the newspaper in Quebec, the feeling is that, yes, the French Canadian, they did have a feeling about France and all of these things, but they were far away from the reality of Quebec and other French Canadian.
Right.
But then when you have the emotional tie that being, and I can tell the same, when I was on the CBF tour in 2011, I felt that emotional tie. And talking with French civilian, I'm a civilian myself, but French people over there in 2011, I felt that connection. But that connection was not there for me before my trip. So I think it could be the same for these soldiers.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'd forgotten that you were a CBF alumnus.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, see, you're a shining example to us all. Now that might help answer that question, and I think Roger Fournier is curious about that relationship. The French Canadians, did they want to fight for Britain and the King, or would they have been fighting to liberate France? I mean, I think your last comment there answers Roger very well. I'm just looking. Here's one from Jacques Demers from the CGG, the Grenadier Guards.
Mm-hmm.
From Caledon, welcome, Jacques. Were reinforcements from Le Vaudreuil de Québec or Le Regiment de Saint-Laurent? Were those regiments that were raised in Canada, and I know Ryan is looking at this stuff too, were those regiments seconded to the Vendus?
The problem with the Vendus, that was interesting. I passed on this because I wanted to focus on Normandy, but the Vendus was pretty much left alone in a way. As soon as the Normandy campaign started, you can see in the sources that the Canadian military headquarters, they made the actual decision, well, in April and May 1944, let's send the last reinforcement to the Italian campaigns. And then everything is focused on the Normandy campaign. And so reinforcements were all directed to the Régiment de Chaudière, Régiment de Maisonneuve, and Fusiliers Mont-Royal. And so the Vendus mostly, in 1944 at least, they had to use every soldiers that were already on the Italian continent, well, not continent, battlefield. Yeah. So they had to remuster again, but from soldiers in Italy, they had to use their soldiers that were wounded and now back to fitness in a way, most of them if they could. And these were the only sources of reinforcement, and that was it, because there was already a shortages in United Kingdom, and as what I can see in the sources, the focus was very much the Battle of Normandy, and now the effort was there. So that's what we can see. So I know that les Fusiliers du Saint-Laurent and les Voltigeurs de Québec at some point, I think they were able to send reinforcement, but I think it was later in the Northwest Europe campaign, but I can be mistaken.
No, I think you're correct on that. That's one thing that I kind of talked a little bit about. They were sent reinforcements down, like I think late 1944, 45. I'm trying to remember exactly when those two regiments were disbanded. And they would have been disbanded along with multiple other
Yes.
French Canadian regiments. So they would have absolutely provided reinforcements, not directly to the Royal 22nd, but to, like, you know, the Chaudières and Fusiliers Mont-Royal and so on, and even to of course Anglo-speaking.
Yes, I've seen some references that French Canadian soldiers were kind of rerouted to English Canadian unit, and I was like, what? what did you do?
Yeah, there's one Canadian MP, I forget what his name is. He goes off about that a lot in Parliament.
Yes. Also we have to remember, as I said earlier, was that there were in spring 1944 there were already French Canadian soldiers that were in English unit, English speaking unit,
Right.
and only up to 5% of the war establishment could be redirect to French speaking unit, because, and again, we can totally understand Canadian military authorities, because for a unit that have been for so long, all these men together, the commanding officer of these units, they don't want to lose these soldiers that have created a bond and that they know and that they're confident in. So that's why you can see that, okay, we can redirect up to 5%, but no more. And then they are all in Normandy, and they are fighting, and so they're dying too.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. You mentioned at one point, Kettler showed the war diary of the Régiment de Maisonneuve was in English.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
were the other units keeping their war diaries in English or in French?
Le Régiment de Chaudière is in French, and Fusiliers Mont-Royal, I think is in French. I can't remember. Right now I switch so often between these two languages. So
I can actually tell you in a second.
Yeah.
Well, you've got the material here, Ryan.
Yes.
If I'm
Here.
correct.
Ryan and Carolyn are two experts on this. They're both.
Yep, Fusiliers Mont-Royal is in English.
Okay,
Is
in
it
English.
Mm-hmm.
Totally can be. But again, I think for these officer or the war diarists, at some point when you're spending so much of your career in English, it's easier to write the technical term in English than try to go and write it in French. As sad as I can be about that, I can understand, because it's the same for me when I'm trying to write an article on battle training in French. It's the worst for me, because all the technical terms are English, and it's making more sense in my head in English for that part.
Well, we could follow up then with Ed Whalen and Brent Wilson. Hi, Brent. Are just asking that this might tie into their questions about operational coordination. Ed asks about French-speaking regiments being supported by English-speaking artillery units and Anglophone forward observation officers, the ones that kept everyone coordinated between the guns and the infantry. So is there a sense that there's a difference in the way in which Francophone units are dealing with the supporting arms?
From what I've seen so far, and I can't say that I've seen everything, but from what I've seen so far, it's mostly, I would say it's mostly the same as for English speaking units, because, well, you know it, the doctrine is from Britain, the organization is from Britain, and everything is from Britain. So of course we're sticking to what's in place. And also, if French Canadian officers wanted to move up in their career, they had to know English. And so I think with the foe and all, they had to deal in English, and that was it. And probably that was what was expected from them. I don't think it was expected for them to speak in French to an English or an Anglophone in that matter. There was a time.
Yeah. It is a long time before Canada and the armed forces become bilingual.
Yes, totally.
So
yes, exactly. And
sort of remember that.
Yes, and also we have to keep in mind that, well, first, these were different times, and also, well, it was not always probably understood from Anglophones that they could give a place to French outside of the regimental structure. Because I think in their mindset, the English-speaking people were more like, well, this is a Canadian army. It has to serve with Britain. So the main language and the main structure, all of these items, they had to be English in a way. So, and I get it. It was part of the time. So it had to evolve, and that's what we have in 1968. It's that, okay, we've seen that we can create a place for French Canadian in this army, and if we want them to actually contribute to the next war, at some point we need to create that place.
Sorry, Ryan, I've jumped in here. Maybe you could ask Jean-Marc Yo's question.
Yeah. This one here, he asks, quelle était la relation entre le général Montgomery et les régiments francophones?
Je n'ai pas beaucoup d'informations sur ce sujet. Je sais que, si mon souvenir est exact, un de ces aides de camp était francophone, mais je n'ai pas plus d'informations. Par contre, ce qu'on voit, par exemple, dans les rapports des censeurs, les censorship reports, il y a beaucoup de respect envers le général Montgomery, mais encore une fois, là, c'est les bribes qu'on reçoit sont plus des unités anglophones. Et l'autre chose, c'est que le contact particulier que Montgomery avait, par exemple, sur le front italien avec la 8e armée, il n'a pas pu établir ce même contact-là de proximité qu'il y avait malheureusement. Donc, je ne suis pas certaine pour les unités en Normandie si on réussi tant les unités francophones qu'anglophones qui ont vraiment réussi à créer un contact avec Montgomery. Contrairement au front italien où vraiment on sent partout dans les unités canadiennes qu'il y a un grand respect pour Montgomery.
I can speak a little bit. Oh,
sorry, Ryan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I can speak kind of like anecdotally to his question. There's one French-Canadian soldier called Léon Major. He was very heavily decorated. I think he liberated an entire village on his own.
Yes.
When he was going to be given one of these medals, I forget. Oh, okay, thanks. I can't remember the medal he was going to get, but it was Montgomery, I think, that was going to give it to him. He refused because he said, no, he's an incompetent person. So that's kind of one thing that kind of answered you.
That is very true, and now I remember this comment. But we also have to remember that Léon Major was quite a character, I would have to say. He was not really respectful of hierarchy. So this whole maybe it wasn't personal about Montgomery. I can't tell for sure. I know there's a new bio, and that just gone out maybe a year ago or 6 months ago about Léon Major. I yet have to read it, so I can't tell for sure. But I do know that he was a bit of an anti-conformist in a way.
Mm-hmm.
We just have time for a few more questions here, so forgive us if we miss your question. Let me see here. Alex Fitzgerald Black, who was with us a few weeks ago, mentions about Tim Cook's recent book about the memory of the Second World War and how did particularly French Canadian veterans in the post-war remember their experience in Normandy or elsewhere?
That's a hard one because what we know so far is that they were quite forgotten in a way. The whole quiet revolution, and this is my take on it, but this has not been backed up by research so far. So that's one of my plans in the future, but still, I think the quiet revolution kind of ghost the whole thing, not ghost, shadow the whole thing. And maybe we have a prior quiet revolution and an after quiet revolution. So we can see that until like the 1990s, nobody was talking about veterans and these people and what they went through and all. And this is coming a bit more right now in the past 30 years. But still, you can see there's something there. In Quebec, particularly, that there's a problem. There's this whole conscription also issue that overshadowed the whole thing. And that's something I really want people at some point to not get rid of, because it's part of the discourse, but not everything about French Canadian in the Second World War is about conscription. And historian, we have not yet done the full research about French Canadian in the Second World War, and so this, I think, affect the memory in the post 1945 years, and the whole question as how Quebec remember, or French Canadian remember the conflict. And in the short way, they don't remember the whole conflict. But I think more and more people are kind of open to this the new findings about, hey, there were French Canadian volunteers. Hey, they were fighting for Canada, and they were not traitors or to the French Canadian nation. No, they were really trying to contribute to this conflict, and and we can see not only this from soldiers, but also from the French Canadian population. The Victory Bounds or the Red Cross Society, the Quebec Society, at least, I'm sure elsewhere in French Canada, we could see it, but what I know most is from Quebec province. We can see that people were willing to contribute to the war effort. So this has to come back in the whole historiography and the memory, but it's not we are not quite there yet.
Yeah. Excellent. I think we are at the end of our time here. So Ryan, thank you. Ryan is doing some great doctoral work in much the same vein as Carolyn. So we appreciate Ryan coming and not only asking, but answering a bunch of questions. And Carolyn, thank you. This has been terrific. And I think the level of discussion that you've generated tonight is a reflection of your terrific presentation. So I will say no more and leave it to Eric to perhaps thank you again and to deal with all of our logistics, but just terrific. I appreciate it so much. And now we're going to have to put you on a battlefield tour.
Always available.
Okay. This sounds good. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just like Jeff said, I'd like to reiterate, of course, Jeff, Ryan, Carolyn, thank you all, and in particular, Carolyn, for giving us such a fascinating talk tonight. I'm not a Second World War historian, but I thought it was fascinating. The relationship between French civilians and French Canadian soldiers, I thought was truly fantastic. So Carolyn, thanks so much for giving us your time tonight. We really appreciate it. Of course, thanks to all of the folks that are tuning in. I know this is, right in the middle of kind of cottage season right now, but I saw we still got, almost 200 people that showed up tonight. So we really appreciate everyone tuning in. We love to see as many people as we possibly can coming to these webinars. So thanks again for showing up. Our next event is actually going to take place in 2 weeks from tonight on the 28th of July, again at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, our usual time slot. Dr. Matthew Barrett of the Canadian War Museum. He's actually going to be delving into the curious case of Lieutenant Reginald Woods and his battle with the Canadian military justice system in 1944 and 1945. So please tune in. It's going to be a ton of fun. Of course, I know I've said this many times, but again, for those that maybe don't know quite yet, because I've got a number of questions asked about this, if you have registered for this talk or for any past talks, does not mean that you have registered for all of the future talks. You will have to go to our website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, in order to register for all of the webinars that you would like to. So please do go to our website. If you enjoyed tonight and you would like to hear more from us, future webinars, publications, conferences, and other things that the Laurier Military Center does, please go to canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/subscribe. And you will receive periodic emails from us about future events, publications, podcasts, and many other things. I guess that's all I really have to say to you all tonight. Thanks again.
Eric, I get the last word tonight.
Ooh, Jeff.
Disembodied voice. It's the 11th of August is Matthew Barrett's presentation.
Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you, Jeff. I forgot to change the date. 11th of August. Today is the 28th of July. We will not be hearing from Matthew tonight. Thanks, Jeff. So yes, 11th of August, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Other than that, thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for Matthew Barrett's talk. Take care, everyone.